Section 1. The Boy Without a Name. Somewhere in the early 1960s, in a quiet neighborhood that history has never found reason to document, a boy was born to parents who were considered exceptional by the careful, watchful eyes of people they would never meet. His parents were intelligent, gifted in ways that made them notable within their own narrow circles. His mother, perhaps a scientist. His father, perhaps an academic. The exact details are sealed behind decades of corporate secrecy and deliberate erasure, because the people monitoring this family did not want the details preserved. They only wanted the child. His real name is never spoken in any file, any document, any game, any record that has survived into the present day. He was taken from his parents while still very young, before he would have been old enough to form any lasting memories of who he truly was or where he had come from. The people who came for him represented an organization that did not yet call itself a corporation. They were agents of a man named Oswell Spencer, and they had a very specific idea about what this particular child was for. The boy was given a new last name, Wesker, the same last name that had been given to other children taken from other families across different countries, different continents, different backgrounds. Children selected not for any particular emotional quality, not for personality or humor or warmth, but for the raw genetic potential they carried, like an inheritance they had no say in receiving. Spencer had spent years developing the criteria for selection. The parents had to represent genuine contributions to human intellectual progress. Their children were the next logical extension of that progress. Only now Spencer intended to accelerate it beyond anything natural selection could achieve in 100,000 years of gradual change. Spencer's project had a name. Project W. The W stood for Wesker, the surname of the chief researcher overseeing the program. Every child selected had that name grafted onto their identity the moment they entered Spencer's care, which was a precise word for an arrangement that was anything but caring. Spencer did not raise these children because he loved them. He raised them because they were instruments. Biological instruments of exceptional quality that needed to be shaped, calibrated, and eventually deployed. The homes they were placed in were comfortable. The schools they attended were excellent. The food was nutritious and the environments were structured in ways designed to maximize intellectual development and minimize emotional clutter. Friendship was possible but not prioritized. Affection was available in regulated doses. The children received the very best that Spencer's considerable wealth could purchase, and in return, without ever being asked to consent to the arrangement, they became part of a program none of them fully understood until it was far too late to matter. Albert, as he would eventually be called, demonstrated from an early age that Spencer's selection criteria had been correct. The boy was brilliant in the way that very few people genuinely are. Not simply good at tests or quick at memorizing information, but analytically sharp in a way that let him see structural patterns in problems that other people could not locate even after hours of careful study. He absorbed mathematics with the same ease that other children absorbed stories. He understood biological systems with an intuitive fluency that his teachers found remarkable and, occasionally, unsettling. He was also cold. Not cruel, not violent, but cold in the way that a clear pane of glass is cold on a winter morning. Functional, present, but not radiating any warmth of its own. His expressions were controlled. His emotions, if they existed in full color, the way emotions exist in most people, were stored somewhere behind those eyes that he would later always keep hidden behind dark sunglasses. Even as a boy, there was something about his gaze that made people uncomfortable in a way they could not articulate. He saw through things. He categorized people and situations the way a scientist categorizes specimens, with interest rather than feeling. The indoctrination process was not presented as indoctrination. That is the elegant cruelty of how Spencer designed it. The children were not told they were being shaped toward a specific ideology. They were simply educated in an environment where certain values were assumed to be universal. The concept that human beings were fundamentally unequal was presented as science rather than opinion. The idea that evolution required selection, that the preservation of weakness was itself a form of violence against potential, was woven into the curriculum the way other schools weave civics or history into their lessons. The children absorbed it because children absorb the frameworks they are raised inside of. There was no alternative perspective offered, no contrary voice, no teacher who thought to present a different view. Albert grew up believing in a version of the world where some people were simply more than others, where his own exceptional intelligence was not luck or privilege, but confirmation of a genuine hierarchy that ran through all of living things, where weakness was a moral failing and excellence was the only form of virtue that mattered in the long run. He did not adopt these beliefs consciously. He was shaped into them the way clay is shaped, before it hardens, before it can resist. Spencer's project was known to almost no one within Umbrella's actual organizational structure. The other co-founders, Edward Ashford and James Marcus, were not informed that Project W existed. It was Spencer's private obsession, financed through his personal fortune, and operated in complete secrecy from the company that Spencer was simultaneously building into one of the most powerful pharmaceutical corporations on Earth. Umbrella was in some ways a front for the progenitor virus research, but Project W was a front within that front, nested inside secrets the way the most dangerous things often are. The children grew up. They pursued the careers that the careful, subliminal guidance of their upbringing had steered them toward. Genetics, biotechnology, virology, biochemistry. Fields where Spencer needed gifted minds who already understood, at a cellular level of their personality, that human experimentation was not a moral problem but a scientific necessity. Albert showed the greatest promise. He was designated test subject number 13 within the project's internal records, and he was elevated above the others in terms of the resources allocated to his education and development. By the time he was old enough to step into the professional world, Albert Wesker already knew things that most scientists spent entire careers trying to understand. He had an almost instinctive grasp of viral mechanics, of how organisms interact at a molecular level, of how genetic information can be manipulated to produce outcomes that nature would never arrive at on its own. And he had something else, something Spencer had tried to cultivate but had not fully succeeded in containing. He had ambition, not Spencer's kind of ambition, which was imperial and outward-looking, a desire to rule over a redesigned world. Wesker's ambition was something colder and more personal. He wanted to become. He wanted to be more than what he was, and he was already extraordinary. He wanted to be something beyond human categories entirely. He did not know yet what form that becoming would take. He did not know that the answer was already being developed in a laboratory beneath the Arklay Mountains, or that the man who would inadvertently give him the key to his own transformation was already waiting at the end of a path that Spencer had been laying out for him since before he could walk. He only knew that he was Albert Wesker, that the name was not the one he had been born with, and that somewhere underneath the cold precision of everything he had become, there was the ghost of a boy who had been taken from parents who never got to watch him grow up. That ghost does not appear in any file. It does not surface in any cutscene or letter or document in 20-plus years of games. But it was there. It had to have been there, in the gap between who he might have been and who Spencer spent years and enormous resources making sure he would become. If you're watching this right now, drop a comment telling me what time it is and where in the world you're watching from. And if you haven't subscribed yet, there's a button right there that takes about 2 seconds to press, and it genuinely helps keep these videos going. Section 2. The Training Center and Birkin. In 1977, Albert Wesker arrived at the Umbrella Executive Training Center. He was approximately 17 years old, though even his exact age is a matter of careful inference rather than confirmed record. The center was housed in a building in the Arklay mountain range outside Raccoon City, positioned close enough to Umbrella's primary Arklay research laboratory that the two facilities could share resources and staff, but separate enough to maintain the appearance of a standard corporate training program for promising young recruits. It was not a standard corporate training program. It was the next stage of Project W. Spencer had taken these exceptional children, educated them in carefully controlled environments, shaped their values and their worldview through years of subtle ideological conditioning, and now he was delivering them to a place where they would be further prepared for the real purpose they had always been intended for. They would receive advanced scientific education. They would learn Umbrella's methods and culture, and they would be monitored every single day to determine which of them had the qualities needed to survive the final stage of the program, which Spencer was still refining. The class of 1978 was not considered impressive by Umbrella's deputy director. Most of the students were talented but unremarkable by the standards of what Spencer needed. The deputy director's assessment was delivered with the kind of institutional bluntness that organizations use when they want to convey disappointment without direct criticism. The class was lackluster, adequate but not exceptional. The kind of people who would become competent middle managers in a pharmaceutical company rather than the architects of a new phase of human existence. Two exceptions were noted: Albert Wesker and a 16-year-old named William Birkin. Birkin arrived at the training center already carrying credentials that should have been impossible for someone his age. He had already achieved doctoral-level understanding in his chosen field. He had already produced research that Umbrella's scientific advisors found genuinely surprising. He was socially awkward in a way that suggested his development had been almost entirely directed toward intellectual achievement at the expense of any other kind of growth. Where Wesker was cold and controlled, Birkin was simply absent when it came to social interaction. Not unkind, not hostile, just genuinely uninterested in the parts of human experience that did not involve biological research. The two recognized something in each other immediately. Not quite friendship, because neither of them was particularly inclined toward that. Something more like mutual recognition. Two instruments of similar quality acknowledging each other's craftsmanship. They would go on to work together for over a decade, and the relationship between them would shape everything that came afterward. They competed with each other, but it was a competition that produced results rather than resentment. Each pushed the other toward greater precision, greater depth, greater willingness to explore the outer edges of what the science could do. Dr. James Marcus ran the training center and took a particular interest in both of them. Marcus was one of Umbrella's co-founders, a man who had spent years developing his own strain of what would eventually be called the T virus, working on leech-based experiments that his colleagues found troubling and that he pursued with an almost religious intensity. He was brilliant in the specific way that scientists who work in isolation for too long tend to become brilliant, which is to say his genius was real, but increasingly untethered from any external perspective. He trusted Wesker and Birkin. He mentored them with what appeared to be genuine investment in their development. He shared elements of his research with them because he believed their promise justified the confidence. They were reporting everything they learned back to Spencer. This is the first significant act of betrayal in Wesker's documented history, and it is notable partly for what it reveals about who he already was at 17 or 18 years old. He did not betray Marcus out of spite or personal resentment. He did not do it because Marcus had wronged him or mistreated him. He did it because Spencer asked him to, and because Wesker had already made the calculation that his future lay in Spencer's direction rather than Marcus's. It was a purely strategic decision made with the kind of emotional disengagement that he would deploy throughout his entire career. Marcus was a useful step. Spencer was the ladder. And Wesker was already thinking about what was at the top of the ladder, even if he could not yet see it clearly. By July 29, 1978, the training center was closed down. The deputy director's criticisms had apparently been noted. Marcus was stripped of his position at the school, though he would continue his research elsewhere. And what Wesker and Birkin were told was a reward for their exceptional performance. They were transferred directly to Umbrella's Arklay laboratory to begin working as senior researchers. The real reason for the reward was the information they had gathered on Marcus, which Spencer used to justify removing his fellow co-founder from his most powerful institutional position. Wesker and Birkin had delivered Marcus to Spencer on a scientific platter, a year, and Spencer had rewarded them with the keys to one of Umbrella's most significant research facilities. Wesker was transferred to the Arklay laboratory at roughly 18 years old. He was already what most people spend entire careers trying to become. He had security clearance at the highest levels of a corporation with enormous power. He had resources and laboratory access that most scientists could not imagine. He had a colleague in Birkin who was equally gifted and who shared the same fundamental orientation toward the work they were about to undertake. And he had the knowledge, somewhere in the back of his mind, that Spencer viewed him as a potential instrument for something far larger than T-virus research. What he did not yet fully understand was how Spencer viewed all of his instruments, as tools to be used until they were no longer necessary and then replaced. He would not understand this fully until much later. By the time he did, he would have spent a decade building something inside Umbrella's labs that Spencer needed and that Wesker had already begun to think of as his own. The laboratory beneath the Arkley Mountains was waiting for them. The T-virus research was waiting for them. And somewhere in the future, a night on July 24th, 1998, was waiting for both of them, though neither could have imagined exactly how it would arrive. Section 3. Arkley Laboratory, the making of a weapon. The Arkley Laboratory sits beneath the Earth in a way that seems almost symbolic in retrospect. It is hidden, underground, sustained by the same mountains that the Spencer mansion overlooks from above. The mansion was built on top of it, in the sense that Spencer had both constructed as complementary elements of the same project, a beautiful estate above that suggested wealth and refined private life, and a research complex below that housed work that no amount of wealth could make respectable. When Wesker and Birkin arrived in 1978, the lab was already engaged in what was called the T-virus project. The T stood for tyrant, though that specific application would not become the project's primary focus for years. The broader goal was to create a strain of the progenitor virus, which Umbrella had discovered in Africa in the late 1960s, that could be used as a controllable biological weapon. The progenitor virus in its natural form was devastating. It killed almost everything it infected. Its mutation rate was extraordinary but unpredictable. What Umbrella needed was a version of it that could be directed. A version that would produce specific, predictable results in infected hosts rather than simply killing them in spectacular and uncontrollable ways. Wesker's specific assignment when he first arrived involved the Ebola virus. Umbrella was publicly presenting its research into Ebola as vaccine development, which gave the laboratory a medically legitimate cover story for working with one of the most lethal pathogens in the world. In reality, the interest in Ebola was about its extraordinary mortality rate. Spencer wanted to understand how to harness that lethality and merge it with the progenitor-derived T-virus research in a way that would produce something entirely new. Wesker and Birkin were handed this problem the way you might hand a gifted chess player a difficult endgame problem. Here are the pieces. Here is the board. Show us what you can do. What they eventually produced was a hybrid. They spliced Ebola genetic material into an existing T-virus strain in a way that changed how the virus interacted with the human immune system. The modified strain was better at bypassing immune defenses. It increased the probability that a human host would survive initial infection while still undergoing the transformative biological changes that Umbrella wanted. The result was the baseline for what would eventually become the zombification effect that the T-virus became notorious for. A host infected with this strain did not simply die. Their higher cognitive functions degraded, while their basic biological drives, hunger, aggression, territorial instinct, amplified dramatically. They became something controllable in theory, directed by hunger rather than by intelligence, which was Umbrella's first step toward the kind of biological weapon they were trying to create. Spencer rejected the use of this early strain as a killing agent specifically, which pushed the research toward a wider array of applications. This redirection was actually what produced the enormous variety of biological organic weapons, or BOWs, that Umbrella would eventually develop. Because the T-virus could not simply be deployed to kill, the researchers had to find ways to make it produce useful things. Monsters with specific capabilities. Organisms designed for specific tactical applications. The hunters. The lickers. Eventually the tyrant. Wesker spent 13 years in that laboratory. 13 years is long enough for a person's relationship with their work to become something that no longer resembles a professional arrangement. He did not merely study the T-virus. He lived with it the way certain researchers live with their subjects, in a state of intimacy that goes beyond the clinical. He knew every variation of the virus that passed through the lab's systems. He knew its failure modes and its exceptional successes. He understood it in the way a musician understands their instrument, not just technically but intuitively, in the place where technical knowledge and instinct become the same thing. Birkin was working in parallel on what would eventually become the G-virus project. A separate strand of research focused on a different kind of mutation, one that produced continuous transformation rather than a stable altered state. While the T virus created a fixed result in infected hosts, the G virus caused its host to keep changing, keep mutating, keep evolving in real time. Birkin became obsessed with it in a way that eventually consumed him entirely. But in the early years of the Arkley lab, his G virus work and Wesker's T virus work complemented each other. They were approaching the same fundamental question from different directions. How much can a human body be transformed while still maintaining some core function? Where is the line between enhancement and dissolution? In 1988, the research reached a stage that Spencer had been waiting for. The Tyrant Project had become Umbrella's most ambitious bow program, attempting to create a human organism so thoroughly enhanced by T-virus infection that it would function as a nearly invincible biological supersoldier. The problem was finding hosts compatible enough to survive the transformation without losing all the qualities that made them useful. The vast majority of human subjects died immediately upon infection. A very small percentage survived but transformed in ways that were too extreme, too uncontrolled, too monstrous to be deployed strategically. True tyrants, organisms that maintained enough structural integrity and controllability to function as weapons, were extraordinarily rare. It was also in 1988 that Spencer made his next move against James Marcus. Marcus had continued his own research in isolation after being removed from the training center, Bayern, and had developed troubling results with his queen leech experiments. The leeches he had been infecting with his own T-virus strain had begun displaying alarming levels of adaptive behavior and apparent consciousness. They had also been responsible for the disappearance of over 20 students at a facility Marcus had reopened. Spencer decided that Marcus had become a liability. He ordered his assassination, and he sent Wesker and Birkin to carry it out. This is the moment where something shifts in Wesker's story that the games never linger on, but that matters enormously. Killing a man is different from reporting on him. Watching the person who mentored you get shot while you stand in the room is different from the kind of academic betrayal that spying represents. Wesker carried out the assignment with the same cold efficiency he brought to everything else. But afterwards, something had changed in his understanding of what Spencer was and what Spencer's relationship to people actually looked like. Marcus had been valuable. Marcus had been a co-founder of the entire enterprise, and Spencer had discarded him the moment he became inconvenient, using the very people Marcus had trusted and mentored to end his life. If Spencer would do that to Marcus, he would eventually do it to Wesker. There was no sentiment in Spencer's calculations. There was only utility. Wesker had watched this lesson get delivered in a way that was impossible to misunderstand. And from 1988 onward, he began making his own preparations. Not immediately, not dramatically, but carefully and systematically. The way someone builds an exit over years before they are ready to use it. By 1991, Birkin's G-Virus project had received official approval from Spencer and Umbrella's leadership, which paradoxically increased Wesker's discomfort rather than reassuring him. Birkin was being elevated. Birkin was becoming indispensable. Wesker had also been making himself indispensable in the T-virus research, but he had begun to recognize his own limitations in a way that someone with his level of pride would have found almost intolerable. He was extraordinary. He was one of the most gifted virologists who had ever worked in the field. But he was working inside a system that had always been designed to use him rather than serve him, and the longer he stayed inside it, the more clearly he could see that. He needed a way out. He needed leverage. He needed something that would let him leave on his own terms, rather than on Spencer's. And in the slowly accumulating wreckage of what had been his entire professional life, he began to find the pieces of the plan that would either give him everything he wanted or get him killed by a monster of his own making. Section 4. The Double Life of Captain Wesker. Sometime in the years following the assassination of Marcus, Wesker left the Arkley laboratory in an official capacity and joined the United States Army. The details of this transition are not extensively documented, but the movement makes sense within the architecture of his long-range plan. He needed credentials that existed outside of Umbrella. He needed a professional identity that gave him access to the kind of government and military networks that could eventually serve as either escape routes or leverage points. The Army provided those credentials. It also provided the thing that Wesker was genuinely well suited for beyond laboratory work, which was command. He was a natural leader in the specific way that produces excellent officers rather than beloved ones. He did not inspire people through warmth or connection. He inspired them through competence. He was always the most capable person in any room he occupied, and he communicated this fact through a kind of absolute calm that people in high-stress environments tend to find immensely reassuring. When Wesker assessed a situation, he did not panic. When things went wrong, he did not display distress. He analyzed, he decided, he acted. These qualities made him exceptional at the kind of leadership that military structures value, and he moved through them with the same efficiency he brought to everything else. From the Army, he transitioned into STARS. The Special Tactics and Rescue Service was a specialized unit attached to the Raccoon City Police Department, and Wesker became the captain of its Alpha team. On the surface, this was a lateral move that did not obviously align with the trajectory of a man who had spent over a decade doing cutting-edge virology research for one of the most powerful corporations in the world. Below the surface, it was the operational deployment of a plan that had been years in the making. The rival company that had recruited Wesker, after he and Birkin began planning their exit from Umbrella, needed something specific from him. Not just the research data he had accumulated across 13 years in the Arkley lab, though that was enormously valuable. They needed combat data, real-world performance information about Umbrella's biological organic weapons, operating under field conditions against trained human opponents. Laboratory data told you how a BOW functioned in a controlled environment. Combat data told you how it functioned when human beings were actively trying to destroy it. Those were very different data sets. STARS was the perfect instrument for generating that data. Highly trained, experienced, equipped with actual combat capability rather than the security theater that most corporate protection units represented. If Wesker could put STARS inside the Arkley lab during a live incident, he would produce the kind of real-world performance data that his new employer would pay for, and pay well. The STARS members under his command were genuinely excellent people. Jill Valentine was one of the best operatives he had ever encountered, trained in entry techniques and combat with a level of competence that Wesker would have found professionally admirable, even as he was planning to use her as an experimental variable. Chris Redfield was physically exceptional and tactically sound. Barry Burton was reliable in the way that certain people with deep personal integrity are reliable. The team was good. Wesker knew they were good. He had made sure they were good because the combat data he was selling would be worth more if it came from opponents who posed a genuine challenge to the BOWs they were facing. He maintained his double life with the same absolute composure he maintained in everything else. He attended briefings. He ran drills. He sat in on team dinners and casual conversations about cases and carried it all off so convincingly that none of the people around him ever had reason to question his loyalty. He was their captain. He gave them missions. He trained them. And the entire time, he was calculating exactly how much of the upcoming incident they would survive and how to position himself to extract maximum value from their encounter with what was already beginning to stir in the tunnels beneath Spencer's estate. The Arkley Mountains were already showing signs of contamination by the spring of 1998. Civilians in the surrounding area were turning up dead or missing. The incidents had the specific signature of T-virus exposure, the bite wounds, the post-mortem behavior of whatever had killed them, and Wesker knew what this meant before his team had any reason to investigate. The Epsilon strain had gotten loose in the Arkley lab below the Spencer mansion. The facility was already compromised, and the contamination was spreading outward through the mountain ecosystem in ways that were going to attract official attention, no matter how carefully Umbrella tried to suppress the information. Wesker prepared for the moment with meticulous care. He arranged to receive a specific item from Birkin, who had not yet broken from Umbrella, but who shared Wesker's assessment that their time inside the corporation was running out. The item was a prototype virus strain, distinct from the standard T-virus, specifically designed to be administered before a lethal event, and to trigger a resurrection process if the host died within a narrow window of time after injection. The virus had been designed as part of Project W, a fail-safe of sorts for the candidates who were supposed to eventually receive a stabilized strain of the progenitor virus. Birkin had developed this prototype with exactly that application in mind. The reported success rate was approximately 90%. Not perfect, but high enough that Wesker judged the risk acceptable. He injected the prototype before leading Alpha Team into the Arklay Mountains on the night of July 24th, 1998. He had already made arrangements with his new employers to deliver the T-002 combat data. He had already positioned himself to collect the biological samples he needed. All that remained was to survive what was about to happen, which was a complicated proposition given that his survival depended on dying first. Section 5. The night the mansion burned. There are events in a story that function as hinges. Moments that the entire weight of what comes before and after passes through. The night of July 24th, 1998 is that moment for Albert Wesker. Everything before this night is prologue. Everything after flows from it with the inevitability of water finding its level. Alpha Team arrived at the Spencer mansion after Bravo Team had gone in earlier and gone silent. This was consistent with Wesker's predictions. The BOWs that had been developing inside the contaminated lab complex beneath the mansion were more than sufficient to neutralize a STARS team that did not know what it was walking into. Bravo Team had not known. They had gone in expecting a standard search and rescue operation and had found something that their training had not prepared them for. Their radio silence told Wesker everything he needed to know about the state of the facility below. He led Alpha Team into the mansion with the practiced authority of someone who has been to this place before. Which, in a sense, he had, though never through the front door and never with a team of people he was planning to sacrifice to monsters he had helped create. He directed them through the corridors and separated them from each other with assignments that maximized their exposure to the BOWs while minimizing their ability to support each other effectively. He was not trying to get all of them killed. He needed data, and dead operators could not generate data. But he needed them scared, isolated, and fighting for their lives against organisms that the rival company needed information about. At some point during the night, Wesker made his way to the laboratory complex beneath the mansion. He had work to do that had nothing to do with rescue. The T-002 Tyrant was housed in the deepest part of the facility, and Wesker had already made arrangements to collect the biological data his employers wanted. He also activated the facility's self-destruct system, which would destroy the lab and everything in it within a set window of time. The explosion would clean up the evidence. The monsters would be erased. The secrets that the Arklay lab had been keeping would be incinerated before anyone could inventory them. He also found Lisa Trevor. Lisa Trevor is one of the most haunting elements of the entire Arklay incident, and Wesker knew her. Not well, not with any warmth, but he knew what she was and what she represented. She was the daughter of the architect who had built the Spencer mansion, a man named George Trevor, who Spencer had imprisoned and killed after he might have become a security risk. Lisa herself had been subjected to prolonged viral experimentation at the Arklay lab for decades, becoming something that the researchers could no longer explain and no longer fully controlled. She was nearly unkillable. She had absorbed viral strains that should have destroyed her many times over and had simply continued, wandering the mansion grounds in a state of preserved and terrible grief, searching for her mother and her father who were never coming back. Wesker encountered her in the tunnels and put her down with the clinical precision of someone closing a file that had been left open too long. It was not mercy. It was operational cleanup, the removal of a loose end that could have complicated his exit from the facility. The fact that Lisa Trevor had been a person once, a girl who had lived in a home and had parents who loved her, before Spencer's project erased all of that, did not appear to register in any document Wesker left behind. Then he released the T-002 Tyrant. The intention was for the Tyrant to produce combat data in an encounter with the surviving STARS members, which it did. What Wesker had not fully accounted for was the precision with which the T-002 found him. The Tyrant's organic targeting systems were not calibrated to distinguish between enemies and the person who had released it. It impaled him, drove a limb through his chest with enough force that the injury should have been immediately fatal, and clinically speaking, it was. His heart stopped. His organs began the process of failure. He collapsed. The prototype virus activated. Birkin had designed it well. The virus recognized the cellular crisis caused by the impalement and began the restoration process, working at a speed that no natural biological mechanism could match. It did not simply heal Wesker's injuries. It used them. It integrated with his damaged cellular structure and began a transformation process that would take weeks to fully manifest, rewriting his biology from the inside in ways that the prototype's designers had theorized but never observed in a living subject who had actually died and been brought back. Wesker woke up. However long after his heart had stopped, however many minutes had passed in the burning facility, with the self-destruct countdown cycling down toward zero, his eyes opened in the smoke and the orange light, and he was alive in a way that was already different from how he had been alive before. He did not know the full extent of what the virus was doing to him yet. He knew he could move when he should not be able to move. He knew the wound in his chest was closing. He knew the heat of the explosion that was consuming the mansion should have been overwhelming and instead felt merely warm. He walked out. The Spencer mansion burned behind him, taking the evidence of Umbrella's experiments with it, taking the Arkley lab and the T-002 and every file and specimen that had been housed there. STAR's Alpha Team survived. Chris and Jill made it out, alive and angry and in possession of enough evidence to begin building a case against Umbrella that would eventually contribute to the corporation's legal and financial destruction. Barry Burton survived, though Wesker had compromised him through threats to his family during the incident. Most of Bravo team had died in the facility hours earlier, and Wesker walked away from the burning mansion into the dark Arklay night, carrying inside his body a virus that was still figuring out what to do with him, and carrying in his mind the knowledge that he had just made himself free. He was no longer Umbrella's instrument. He was no longer Spencer's project. He had died and come back as something new, and the thing he had come back as belonged entirely to himself. In the days and weeks that followed, the changes became impossible to ignore. He could move faster than any person had a right to move. Not slightly faster, significantly faster, in a way that looked impossible to anyone watching. He could cover distances in the time it should take to draw a breath. His strength had increased to levels that defied anything that conventional human biology could account for. Wounds healed with startling speed. His body processed trauma that would have incapacitated anyone else and returned to full function within hours. The dark glasses he now wore everywhere were partly practical and partly statement. His eyes had changed. The color, the quality of his vision, aspects of his appearance that he did not need people examining closely. The sunglasses created a barrier between the world and the evidence of what he had become. They also completed something aesthetically, the cold precision of the man finding its visual expression in lenses that revealed nothing about what was behind them. He was something new. He did not yet have a complete name for it, but he knew that everything that came next would be on his terms, not Spencer's, not Umbrella's. His. Section 6 by Gunn, The Shadow Broker, 1998 to 2002. The world believed Albert Wesker was dead. This was exactly how he needed it, at least for a while. The explosion and fire at the Spencer mansion had been comprehensive enough that establishing exactly who had and had not survived the incident was genuinely difficult. Umbrella had its own reasons to suppress the truth about the incident, rather than investigate it carefully. The STAR's survivors, Chris and Jill, had made it out, but were being actively discredited by Umbrella's considerable resources. Official channels were not particularly interested in finding out what had actually happened in the Arklay Mountains. Wesker spent the period immediately following his resurrection, making himself useful to the rival organization that had recruited him. He had delivered what they wanted from the Arklay incident: the combat data, the biological samples he had managed to extract before the facility burned. The organization, referred to in various documents as simply the rival company, or more specifically HCF, a private organization with deep pockets and a very specific interest in weaponizable viral research, rewarded him with the resources to continue operating independently while working on their behalf. He did not disappear entirely. He moved through shadows, which was a new kind of existence for someone who had previously operated in the relatively well-lit institutional world of Umbrella's research programs. He had contacts, safe locations, access to laboratory facilities that the organization made available to him, and an income that came from selling exactly what he had always known how to produce. Information, biological samples, research data. He was the world's most dangerous bioweapons broker who did not look like a bioweapons broker. He looked like a man in dark glasses who occasionally appeared in unexpected places and then was gone again. Raccoon City was the next major event on the timeline, and while Wesker did not personally cause it, he was positioned to benefit from it. The chaos began in September 1998, when the T-virus contamination that had been spreading through the Arkley Mountains ecosystem finally reached the city itself, partly through the actions of Umbrella's own internal security apparatus, attempting to suppress evidence of the corporation's culpability in the Arkley incident. Dr. William Birkin had reached the end of his own relationship with Umbrella by this point. He had refused to give up the G-virus research he had spent years developing, and Umbrella had sent a retrieval unit to simply take it from him by force. Birkin injected himself with the G-virus rather than let them have it. He should have died immediately. Instead, he began transforming, and the transformation was catastrophic in a way that even Wesker, who had watched the G-virus research develop for years, would have found difficult to predict precisely. Birkin killed the retrieval team. The G-virus samples scattered into Raccoon City's sewage and water systems. The T-virus spread from there in ways that spiraled completely beyond any possibility of containment. Within weeks, Raccoon City was a total loss. The U.S. government made the only decision available to it in October 1998, a sterilization bombing that erased the city from the map rather than risk the contamination spreading further. Umbrella's role in the disaster became legally documented. The company that had spent decades hiding behind its pharmaceutical cover story finally exposed in a way that no amount of corporate spin could manage. Wesker watched from a distance and collected what he needed. Ada Wong had been operating in Raccoon City during the outbreak, and through a complicated arrangement involving risks that another person would have found suicidal, she managed to obtain a sample of the G-virus for Wesker's organization. This gave HCF access to Birkin's greatest work, the research that Birkin himself had died to protect. Wesker filed it away with the calm of someone adding an important document to a growing archive. It would be useful later. Almost everything was useful to the right mind in the right context. The next significant move came in 2000, when Wesker led an assault on Rockford Island, a facility in the South Atlantic that had been run by the Ashford family as part of their connection to Umbrella. The Ashfords were the third founding family of Umbrella Corporation, though by 2000 the family's power had been dramatically reduced from its early prominence. The island housed a prison facility and, in its deeper levels, the cryogenically preserved body of Alexia Ashford, the daughter of Alexander Ashford, who had developed the T. Veronica virus, and then injected herself with it before entering a 15-year cryogenic sleep specifically designed to allow the virus to integrate with her biology without killing her. The T. Veronica strain was something Wesker had been interested in for years. It was not a version of the virus he had worked on at the Arkley lab. It was an entirely separate lineage developed from a different foundational stock with different properties. Its most significant difference was the capacity for horizontal gene transfer at a level that allowed the host to manifest genuinely extraordinary biological abilities if the integration was successful. Alexia had been in cryo since 1983. By the time of the Rockford Island incident in 2000, she had been asleep for 17 years, and the T. Veronica virus had been working on her body for all of that time. Wesker's assault on the island also happened to catch Claire Redfield there as a prisoner, Claire having been arrested while conducting her own investigation into Umbrella in Europe. He did not particularly care about Claire. He had other objectives. But the island's T-virus containment failed during the assault, which produced the kind of chaos that covered his actual mission, while also giving him the combat data that remained a standing professional obligation. He was also there when Alexia finally emerged from cryo and revealed exactly what 17 years of successful T. Veronica integration had produced. She was not what any prior Umbrella research had managed to create. She had genuine biological control over her own mutation, could manifest abilities that resembled supernatural fire manipulation because what she was actually doing was triggering bioluminescent chemical reactions in her own tissue at extraordinary temperatures. She was, in a limited sense, the thing that Spencer had always claimed to be trying to create, a genuinely evolved human being. Chris Redfield arrived on the island looking for his sister and destroyed Alexia before Wesker could complete his acquisition. This irritated Wesker enough that he confronted Chris directly, which produced their first real physical encounter following the mansion incident. Wesker threw Chris across a room to demonstrate the gap between what he had become and what a normal human being remained, then declined to kill him because doing so would have served no particular purpose, and because Wesker had what he had actually come for. Steve Burnside, a young man who had been imprisoned on Rockford and had become involved with Claire during the outbreak, had been infected with T. Veronica before dying. His body carried a live sample of the virus integrated into human tissue. Wesker took the body, he collected the sample, and he left with the T. Veronica research tucked among his growing collection of viral materials, each one a thread that would eventually be woven into something that Wesker was not yet ready to reveal. The period between 2000 and 2002 was one of quiet collection and careful positioning. Umbrella was dying. The legal consequences of Raccoon City were moving through the court systems of multiple countries, and the company's cover stories were crumbling in real time. The US government and the Russian government were both pursuing cases that would eventually force Umbrella into bankruptcy. The corporation that had housed and fed Wesker's entire professional life was becoming a ruin. He wanted what was inside that ruin before it fully collapsed. Specifically, he wanted the UMF-013, Umbrella's central supercomputer and data archive, which had been quietly relocated to a facility in Russia by Sergei Vladimir, an Umbrella executive who had remained loyal to the corporation's original vision and who had been trying to preserve Umbrella's assets against what he could see coming. The UMF-013 contained essentially everything. Every research file, every experimental protocol, every dataset that Umbrella had generated across decades of operation. It was the entire collected intelligence of the corporation, compressed into a system that Wesker could use as a foundation for whatever he built next. In 2003, Wesker went to Russia to get it. He moved through an Umbrella facility that was simultaneously collapsing under biological contamination, while being contested by Chris and Jill, who were there on a BSAA mission. He avoided them, which was not difficult given the chaos. He found Vladimir, who was by this point deeply infected with whatever virus had gotten loose in the Russian facility, mutating into something almost unrecognizable while still insisting on his loyalty to Spencer and Umbrella. Wesker destroyed him. He extracted the UMF-013, and he walked out of Russia with the complete archive of Umbrella's research history in his possession. Umbrella was formally declared bankrupt shortly after. The corporation that had shaped his entire existence from childhood was gone. Wesker owned more of its knowledge than anyone else alive. He was 30 years into a life that had been built for someone else's purposes, and for the first time, all of the pieces were in his hands rather than Spencer's. Section 7. The Arms Dealer and the Spider, 2002 to 2004. The years immediately following Umbrella's collapse found Wesker operating in a way that resembled a spider at the center of a very large web. He had the virus samples. He had the Umbrella archives. He had the kind of knowledge that other people, organizations, governments, and bioweapons markets would pay extraordinary sums to access. He had the enhanced biology that made him functionally unkillable by conventional means. He had a private military organization, HCF, at his disposal for operations that required personnel rather than individual action. And he needed resources, enormous resources. The plan that was beginning to crystallize in his mind required infrastructure on a scale that could not be assembled cheaply or quickly. He needed time and money and access to facilities that could support viral research at a level that had previously only been possible inside Umbrella's massive institutional apparatus. To get those things, he would do what he had always done. He would make himself useful to people with needs he could satisfy. Javier Hidalgo was the first major client of this period. Hidalgo was a drug lord operating in an unnamed South American country, controlling territory through the kind of casual, organized violence that made him effectively a regional government with better weapons than the actual government. He had been purchasing viral materials from Umbrella for over a decade, but Umbrella's collapse had ended that arrangement. More pressingly, Hidalgo's daughter Manuela was dying of a degenerative disease, and Hidalgo was not a person who accepted that reality calmly. Wesker made contact in 2002. He had what Hidalgo needed, or something close enough that a desperate man would accept it. The T. Veronica virus, the sample Wesker had taken from Steve Burnside's body at Rockford Island, had properties that could theoretically arrest or overwrite a degenerative condition. The catch, which Wesker explained in broad terms while leaving the specific implications for Hidalgo to discover on his own timetable, was that T. Veronica required 15 years of cryogenic incubation to integrate successfully. Alexia had slept in ice for 17 years. Without that period of carefully managed stasis, the virus's integration was incomplete in ways that produced dangerous and unpredictable results. Hidalgo bought the virus anyway, because the alternative was watching his daughter die. He did not put Manuela into cryostasis. Instead, he attempted to manage the integration by repeatedly transplanting his daughter's organs, replacing the organs that the virus was destroying before they could fail completely. This produced results that were medically extraordinary and personally horrifying. Manuela survived. She developed the ability to generate and project intense bioluminescent fire from her blood. But her body was increasingly dependent on organ transplants sourced from people who could not consent to providing them. Wesker watched from a distance, which was a phrase that described his relationship to almost every situation in this period. He watched Hidalgo's deal deteriorate into disaster. He watched Leon S. Kennedy and Jack Krauser arrive in 2002 as part of a U.S. government operation to investigate the bioweapon sales. He watched the entire situation resolve in ways that served his purposes without requiring his direct involvement. When Hidalgo used the virus on himself and transformed into something massive and barely recognizable as anything human, the U.S. operatives destroyed him. They also generated combat data. They also revealed the capabilities and limitations of T. Veronica infection in a live field context. Wesker filed everything away. Jack Krauser was something Wesker found interesting. The soldier had performed excellently during the Hidalgo operation, demonstrating the kind of tactical precision and physical capability that made him genuinely useful. Krauser had also left military service under circumstances that left him bitter and seeking something that his previous life could no longer provide. He had suffered an injury that had effectively ended his combat career, and he had found his way to Wesker through a combination of desperation and the specific kind of anger that very capable people feel when they believe their capabilities are being wasted. Wesker offered him what everyone who came to him ultimately came for: enhancement, not as a gift or a reward, but as a tool. He gave Krauser access to a dominant Las Plagas parasite sample, which was a different category of biological modification from the T-virus-based research that had dominated most of Wesker's portfolio up to this point. The plagas were derived from parasitic organisms discovered in a region of rural Spain, specifically connected to a cult called Los Iluminados, led by a man named Osmond Sadler. The dominant strain of plagas granted extraordinary physical capabilities while maintaining the host's cognitive function, a meaningful improvement over many T-virus-derived modifications. In 2004, Wesker sent Krauser to infiltrate Los Iluminados. The mission objective was to steal a dominant plagas sample directly from Sadler's organization. To give Krauser cover for the infiltration, Sadler was offered a kidnapping job that aligned with his own desire for leverage against the U.S. government. The target was Ashley Graham, the president's daughter. Ashley was taken. Sadler's organization became consumed with the kidnapping and its complications. Leon S. Kennedy was sent in to retrieve her, which produced another set of confrontations and combat data that Wesker absorbed into his growing understanding of plagas capabilities under field conditions. The entire Spanish operation was a masterpiece of resource leverage. Wesker was simultaneously collecting viral samples, testing plagas capabilities, using one government's investigation to generate intelligence about another entity's bioweapons program, and positioning Krauser inside Sadler's organization to deliver what he actually needed. He also had Ada Wong operating in the same theater as backup, which is where things became slightly less elegant. Ada had her own interests that did not perfectly align with Wesker's, and she had been running a parallel operation on behalf of another client whose identity she did not share with Wesker. She delivered him a subordinate plagas sample rather than the dominant one she had obtained. Wesker received the lesser sample while the dominant one went elsewhere. It was an irritant, a significant one given how carefully he had orchestrated the entire operation. But it also left him with Krauser's corpse, which carried a dominant plagas strain, and it left him with the architecture of the next phase of his plan, fully loaded with the intelligence and samples and resources he needed to move toward what he actually wanted. He did not want to be an arms dealer forever. The bioweapons market was a means, a way of generating resources and gathering the specific materials he needed. The thing he actually wanted was larger than anything the market could contain, and it required a partner with access to infrastructure that he could not build alone in the time he had to work with. He found that partner in a woman named Excellagione. Section 8, The Road to Godhood, 2004 to 2006. Excellagione was 21 years old when she first connected with Wesker in any meaningful professional capacity, though the exact circumstances of their initial contact are not precisely documented. She was the product of intersecting aristocratic lineages with family connections to Tricell, a pharmaceutical conglomerate with three major divisions: pharmaceuticals, natural resources, and shipping. Through her grandmother, she was connected to the Travis family that had founded Tricell's pharmaceutical operations. She was also independently brilliant in a way that had been recognized early and had produced an academic trajectory that left her with a genetics degree at an unusually young age. She wanted power, not in the vague way that many ambitious people want power, as a general improvement in their circumstances and status. In the specific, articulated way that someone who has thought carefully about what they want and has the intelligence to pursue it tends to want things. She wanted to lead Tricell's most significant division. She wanted to be at the center of something that mattered at a civilizational scale. She wanted to be the kind of person whose decisions shaped outcomes, rather than the kind of person whose outcomes were shaped by others' decisions. Wesker offered her a path to exactly that. In exchange for Tricell's resources and infrastructure, he would provide something no other partner could offer: access to the complete Umbrella archive, decades of viral research that no other entity on Earth possessed, a direct line to the original progenitor virus research site in Africa, which he could lead Tricell to through the intelligence he had gathered from Umbrella's records, and a plan, an actual plan for what to do with all of it. The plan was Ouroboros. And to understand what Ouroboros represented, it is worth pausing for a moment to trace how Wesker had arrived at it, because the virus was not simply another weapon. It was the culmination of everything Spencer had tried to build, executed by the instrument Spencer had built to execute it, but pointed in a direction Spencer had never intended. Spencer had wanted to create superior human beings. He had wanted to remake humanity in a form he found more worthy of existence. His vision was fundamentally about selection, about culling the species down to the people he considered genuinely valuable and elevating them to something greater through viral enhancement. What he lacked was a mechanism. The progenitor virus in its various forms was too unpredictable, too lethal, too likely to destroy what it was meant to preserve. Wesker had a mechanism. He had the accumulated research of 30 years of Umbrella's viral science, the T virus and all its variants, the G virus samples from Birkin's lifework, the T. Veronica research from Alexia Ashford, the Plagas data from the Spanish operation, and above all his own body, which had been transformed by the prototype virus into a living laboratory for studying what enhancement actually looked like in a functioning human being. The Ouroboros virus was built on the progenitor virus but modified using everything Wesker had collected. Its design goal was specific and brutal. A person infected with Ouroboros would either integrate with it successfully, demonstrating the kind of genetic compatibility that Wesker had decided was the true measure of what he was starting to call evolutionary superiority, or they would be destroyed by it. Integrated hosts would be transformed into something genuinely extraordinary. Rejected hosts would be consumed, their cellular structure broken down, and incorporated into a mass of writhing biological material that moved with a kind of desperate, violent energy. The compatibility rate was extremely low. Almost no one could survive Ouroboros integration. This was the point. Wesker intended to release Ouroboros globally, spreading it through an aerial delivery system using missiles loaded with the virus. Most of humanity would be consumed. The tiny fraction of people whose biology was compatible enough to survive integration would emerge transformed, enhanced, fundamentally different from the rest of the species that had preceded them. They would be the foundation of what came next. And Wesker, already enhanced, already beyond ordinary human capability, would be their effective god. Spencer had wanted to be a god. He had tried to build the instruments that would let him become one, and had failed because he was building them from the outside as a designer rather than a participant. Wesker had been inside the system from the beginning, shaped by it, transformed by it, and he had arrived at a version of Spencer's goal that Spencer had never managed to articulate clearly enough to pursue. Wesker was not trying to rule over a new human race. He was trying to become the apex of a new order of existence, something that would look back at the humanity that preceded it, the way that humanity looks back at the primates that preceded us. Exela understood this vision, or enough of it to find it genuinely compelling. She also had the more immediate and pragmatic goal of becoming Wesker's partner in the new world that followed, which he allowed her to believe was possible because her belief in that outcome made her significantly more useful to him than she would have been if she understood the full truth. Wesker did not intend to share power with anyone. He had never intended to share power with anyone. But Excela's assumption that she would rule alongside him as his queen in a transformed world was exactly the kind of motivation that made her willing to deploy Tricell's enormous resources and influence on his behalf without reservation. Through Excela, Wesker gained control of Tricell's African operations. The Kijuju Autonomous Zone in West Africa was adjacent to the area where the Ndapaya tribe had historically cultivated the Stairway to the Sun, the flower from which the original progenitor virus had been derived. Umbrella had maintained a research facility in the region decades earlier, and that facility still existed in partially usable condition beneath the landscape. Tricell rebuilt and expanded it under Excela's direction, using it as the primary site for Ouroboros development. Wesker also had another resource that most people did not know was in his possession: Jill Valentine. After the Spencer estate encounter in 2006, which we will come to in a moment, Wesker had both Jill's physical presence and Jill's biology to work with. Jill had survived the years following the Raccoon City incident with an elevated level of antibodies related to T-virus exposure from her previous encounters with biological contamination. Her immune system had been shaped by those encounters in ways that made her particularly interesting for Ouroboros research. She had qualities that helped stabilize the virus in testing scenarios. Using her body as both a research tool and a controlled test environment helped Wesker and Excela accelerate the Ouroboros development timeline significantly. But before all of this, there was the Spencer estate. And that encounter reshaped everything in ways that Wesker had partially anticipated, but had not fully accounted for in how it would leave him feeling. Spencer had been in hiding for years following Umbrella's collapse. He was old. He was connected to life support systems. He was dying in the way that old men die when they have outlived their context, slowly and with full awareness of everything they are losing. He had arranged for his location to be leaked through a careful chain of intermediaries, with the intention of bringing Wesker to him for one final meeting. He had something to tell his most successful project, and he apparently believed that Wesker would find the information useful or even gratifying. Chris and Jill arrived at the Spencer estate in August 2006 on a BSAA operation, having received intelligence about Spencer's location through a reliable source. They found the estate's staff already dead, killed by someone who had arrived before them. They fought through the estate's extensive and still functional trap systems. And they arrived at Spencer's private chamber to find Spencer dead in his wheelchair and Wesker standing at the window. What had passed between Spencer and Wesker in the minutes before Chris and Jill arrived was documented partially in the conversation Wesker had with them immediately afterward, and in what Wesker himself said to Chris years later when they met again. Spencer had revealed Project W in full. He had explained to Wesker that everything about him, his name, his education, his values, his entire sense of self, was the product of Spencer's deliberate construction. He was not a person who had independently developed these qualities. He was a designed product, the most successful of Spencer's test subjects, the only one who had integrated the prototype virus successfully. And Spencer had somehow convinced himself that revealing this would create a moment of shared triumph, a confirmation that the project had worked exactly as intended. What it actually created was something different. Wesker had spent years knowing that his early life had been shaped by Spencer's project. What he had not fully known was the extent of it, the depth of the shaping, the degree to which even his God complex, his belief in his own superiority, his drive towards something beyond human limitation, were not truly his own, but were themselves engineered outcomes of a process he had been subjected to before he was old enough to resist it. He killed Spencer with a single strike. His hand through the old man's chest, which is a gesture that had a specific symbolic register for Wesker that probably required very little conscious consideration. He had been the instrument of Spencer's will his entire life. Now he was ending that relationship in the most direct way available to him. Chris and Jill arrived and engaged him. He was not looking for a fight with them in that specific moment. He was processing something more significant than a fight. But when the encounter escalated, he threw Chris around with the casual ease of someone demonstrating a point. And when Jill tackled him through the chamber window to save Chris from a strike that would have killed him, Wesker went out the window with her. They fell together from the estate into the dark water below, and the BSAA subsequently found no bodies. The presumption of death for both of them held for months. In reality, Wesker survived because he always survived now. And he kept Jill alive because she had just become more valuable to him than she had ever been as an adversary. Section 9. Kijuju, the final stage. By 2009, the Ouroboros plan was complete. That sentence is worth letting sit for a moment. A man who had been born into an arrangement he did not choose, who had spent his entire childhood being deliberately shaped into a specific kind of instrument, who had spent his adult life inside institutions that used him while he used them in return, who had died and been resurrected by a virus that transformed him beyond conventional human biology, who had spent more than a decade collecting the resources and knowledge and viral samples needed to build the thing he was building, had finished building it. The Ouroboros virus existed. The delivery mechanism existed. Excella's network within Tricell had secured the logistics. The missiles were loaded. The plan was operational. Everything that had been building since a boy without a real name was taken from his parents. Somewhere in the early 1960s had arrived at this point. There was one complication that had been developing for some time that Wesker had been managing, but that was becoming increasingly difficult to fully suppress. The prototype virus that had resurrected him in 1998 was not stable at the enhanced levels of activity that his life since 2000 had been generating. He needed regular injections of a compound called PG67-AW to regulate the virus and keep it from overexpressing itself in ways that would destroy the very body it had transformed. Excella had been managing these injections, which was another thread in the complex web of dependency and manipulation that their partnership represented. She had access to the compound. She administered it regularly. She was one of the few people aware of this vulnerability. The BSAA sent Chris Redfield to the Kajiju Autonomous Zone in March 2009, paired with a local agent named Sheva Alamar. The mission was officially to investigate and apprehend Ricardo Irving, a bioweapons dealer Tricell had been using to fund its operations through black market sales of Type 2 and Type 3 Plagas strains that were being tested on the local population. The Kijuju inhabitants infected with these Plagas variants became Majini, organisms exhibiting a range of mutations depending on the type and maturity of the infection. The region had essentially been turned into a field testing environment for Tricell's products, with the local population serving as the test subjects. Chris and Sheva were not told about Wesker. They were not told about Ouroboros. They were not told about Jill Valentine's presence in the region or her condition. They were sent to find Irving, and everything they discovered after that was information they extracted through the kind of persistence and refusal to stand down that made Chris Redfield specifically a problem that Wesker had never fully managed to solve. Jill Valentine had been kept alive for 3 years as a research asset and occasionally as a weapon. The P30 compound that was being administered to her through a device attached to her chest was not simply a control mechanism. It was a performance enhancer that had been developed in part using Jill's own biology, the T-virus antibodies in her system interacting with the compound in ways that produced extraordinary physical capability alongside the psychological control. Jill under P30 was faster and stronger and more dangerous than she had been before, which made her extremely effective as a deployed asset and also extremely difficult to fight if you cared about her survival. When Chris and Sheva were getting close to the truth about the operation, Wesker deployed Jill as an obstacle. She engaged them in the ruins of a structure near one of Tricell's research sites, wearing the kind of combat suit that obscured her identity effectively enough that Chris did not immediately recognize her. When he did recognize her, the fight transformed into something more complicated than combat. He was not trying to defeat Jill. He was trying to not hurt Jill while Jill was fully engaged in trying to destroy both of them. The P-30 device on her chest was the key. Its removal was the answer. Sheva reached it during a moment when the fight had created the opening needed, and without the compound feeding into her system, Jill collapsed into the kind of exhaustion that 3 years of being kept in a chemically maintained enhanced state will produce in a human body. She was alive, she was herself again, though shattered in ways that would take longer than a few minutes to assess. She told them to stop Wesker, and she was right that they needed to. Exila had been serving Wesker's interests throughout the operation with genuine devotion and deepening delusion. She had become convinced that she and Wesker were partners in the truest sense, that his appreciation for her intelligence and capability translated into something personal rather than purely instrumental. She had been wrong about this for the entirety of their relationship, and Wesker demonstrated that fact with characteristic abruptness when he injected her with the Ouroboros virus without warning. Her body rejected it. She was not compatible. The rejection produced exactly the kind of transformation that an unsuccessful Ouroboros infection produced. A catastrophic dissolution of her cellular structure into a mass of expanding biological material that consumed her from the inside out. She was betrayed by the person she had given everything for, and she probably spent the final minutes of her awareness understanding that she had always been exactly what Wesker had called his tools from the beginning. Useful until she was not. Disposable after that. Chris and Sheva fought through the Tri-Cell facility and beyond it, pursuing the thread of the operation toward its source. They discovered the full scope of the Ouroboros plan, the missiles loaded with the virus, the scale of what would have been released if they had arrived even a few hours later. They destroyed what they could destroy and continued moving. Wesker had been aboard a bomber aircraft positioned to carry out the final stage of the delivery plan. The aircraft carried the Ouroboros warheads and was meant to reach altitude and release them in a dispersal pattern that would cover a geographic area large enough to be catastrophic. Chris and Sheva got aboard. Wesker was aware of their presence and not particularly threatened by it, because nothing that had come before had suggested that Chris Redfield was capable of killing him. Everything that had come before had suggested the opposite. But the PG-67AW injections. That was the thing. Somewhere in the chaos of the final confrontation aboard the aircraft, something went wrong with the dosage. Whether it was Excella's absence and the disruption that caused to the careful management of his injection schedule, or whether in the urgency of the moment, Wesker simply administered too much of the compound himself, the effect was the same. The prototype virus in his system, which the PG-67-AW was designed to suppress at high activity levels, began overexpressing. His enhanced metabolism started processing too fast. The virus that had made him extraordinary was now running at a level that his body could not sustain. He knew something was wrong. The superhuman precision that had always been the reliable constant of his existence began showing cracks. His movements were still extraordinary but occasionally erratic. He was no longer operating at the controlled peak he had maintained for 11 years. He was in a state he had never been in before, genuinely compromised in ways that he could not immediately compensate for. Chris and Sheva fought him through the crashing aircraft and into the landscape beyond it, following him through terrain that was actively volcanic. The final confrontation happened in the throat of an active volcano, which is either the most operatically appropriate location for Wesker's final scene, or a reflection of how dramatically the Resident Evil series was willing to commit to a visual statement in 2009. Section 10. The Volcano and What Remained. There is a conversation that needs to happen about what Albert Wesker actually was in those final minutes. Not what the virus had made him, not what Spencer had designed him to be, but what was left when all of that was stripped away by an overdose that was killing him, even as he refused to stop fighting. He had always been dying in a way. From the moment the prototype virus had first taken hold of his body in the burning Spencer mansion, he had been sustained by a biological process that was never fully stable, that required constant chemical management to prevent it from consuming him the way Ouroboros consumed everything it could not assimilate. The extraordinary capabilities he had used to reshape the world's bioweapons black market, to manipulate governments and organizations and the people who ran them, to collect the viral heritage of Umbrella and weaponize it into something new, all of it ran on a mechanism that had a timer built into it from the beginning. Wesker did not know this with certainty. Or perhaps he did know it and had decided it was irrelevant to his plans, which is its own kind of statement about a man who had spent his life pursuing immortality through biological enhancement while carrying a biological enhancement that was itself mortal. The volcanic environment gave the fight its visual texture. Lava below, the heat, the rock face, Chris and Sheva on one side, Wesker on the other, all three of them operating in a landscape that made the combat feel genuinely primal, in a way that the corporate laboratories and African military installations of the rest of the game had not quite managed. The Earth itself was the arena, and it was not a neutral arena. The lava was patient in the way that geological processes are patient. It did not care who fell in. Wesker was still fast, still strong, still functionally more capable than any normal human being, even in his compromised state. He demonstrated this repeatedly during the fight, and Chris and Sheva survived as much through their own determination and the specific tools the game provides, as through any straightforward physical advantage. The weaknesses that the virus overdose had created were real but narrow. Specific points on his body where the overexpression of the virus had made the tissue vulnerable in ways that could be exploited if you could identify them and reach them under the conditions of an active fight. They exploited them. That is the short version. The longer version is that Chris Redfield, who had been fighting Albert Wesker in one form or another since July 24, 1998, had developed a specific and highly personal understanding of how Wesker fought, how he thought, and what it took to create an opening against someone who had spent 11 years being functionally unkillable. He had been losing to Wesker for over a decade, and he had accumulated something from each of those losses that was not wisdom exactly, but was something adjacent to it. The specific knowledge of what Wesker would do when the fight was going his way, and how to survive long enough for the fight to stop going his way. When Wesker fell into the lava, it was not the end. He had survived things that should have ended him before. His biology had come back from injuries that by any reasonable assessment should have been fatal multiple times. The lava was different, but the prototype virus was also still active and overexpressed, which meant his regeneration was operating at levels that were simultaneously enhanced and catastrophically unstable. He reached up from the lava for the helicopter that was carrying Chris and Sheva and Jill and Josh Stone toward safety. He grabbed for it with a hand that should not have been functional. He pulled at it with the kind of strength that an organism driven by 11 years of biological enhancement and genuine fury could still muster even while dissolving. 2 rocket-propelled grenades, fired by Chris and Sheva simultaneously from launchers that Jill had spotted aboard the helicopter. That was the answer. Not 1. 2, because 1 had never been enough for Albert Wesker, and in the end it still took 2 to finish it. The explosion confirmed what the lava had begun. The last thing Wesker had done was reach for the helicopter. Not to escape, because the state he was in had probably already moved beyond any realistic possibility of survival. But to pull something down with him, to not be the only thing that ended in that moment. It was very much in character. He died in March 2009, approximately 49 years old, if the general estimates about his birth year around 1960 are correct. He had lived most of those years inside a project designed for someone else's purposes. He had spent roughly 11 years operating outside that project on his own terms. He had transformed himself from the inside of the human species, looking outward to something that stood outside and looked at humanity as raw material for a transformation it had not consented to. He had been a scientist, a corporate trader, an arms dealer, a bioterrorist, and very briefly, in his own reckoning, something approaching a god. What he left behind was more than anyone who killed him probably wanted to think about carefully. The Ouroboros virus still existed in samples that survived the Kajuju incident. The Umbrella archives, most of them, were in locations that had not been destroyed. The methodology he had developed for combining viral strains in specific ways was documented in research that lived in multiple places simultaneously, because Wesker was methodical enough to ensure that no single catastrophic event could erase everything. The knowledge of how to approach the kind of transformation he had been pursuing was now in the world in ways that could not be recalled. Alex Wesker was still alive, the one other survivor of Project W, the child Spencer had selected and shaped alongside Albert, but who had taken an entirely different path toward the same ultimate goal. Alex had developed a degenerative disease that made the standard Project W progression impossible for her. She could not simply be infected with the prototype virus and transform the way Albert had been. She needed something else, a way to transfer her consciousness into a healthy body that could then receive the viral enhancement and continue Spencer's work in her name. She had spent her post-Umbrella years pursuing this goal, in the same methodical way that all of Spencer's children pursued their goals, in the Resident Evil Revelations 2 timeline that unfolded years after the Kajuju incident. The legacy that Wesker left was not, primarily, the individual catastrophes he had caused. Raccoon City cannot be credited entirely to him, though his fingerprints were on its edges. The Kajuju incident was his most direct creation, and it ended with his death. These were events with specific geographic scope that could be documented and eventually stopped. The deeper legacy was something more structural. He had demonstrated, completely and with the support of the most comprehensive viral research archive in the world, that the kind of transformation Spencer had theorized was achievable. Not perfectly, not without cost, not in the form that Spencer had imagined, but achievable. A human being could be taken apart at the cellular level by viral mechanisms and put back together as something more. The question of what you lost in that process, the boy who had been taken from his parents, the human connections that a cold intelligence never sought, the name that belonged to someone else, was not a question that the virus addressed. It was only a question that the history of the person infected could answer. Wesker's history was a long series of things he had been stripped of. His name, his parents, the genuine friendships he might have formed if his upbringing had encouraged them rather than designed them out of him. The choice of whether to pursue the path he pursued, because even though he made choices, the values that drove those choices had been installed in him by someone else before he was old enough to interrogate them. He never had the conversation where he sat down and honestly examined whether the boy Spencer had taken from his parents would have chosen this, whether the person he might have been, without the training center and the Arkley lab and the prototype virus, would have looked at Ouroboros and seen a gift rather than a catastrophe. Whether the god he tried to become was actually what he wanted or what Spencer had spent his childhood teaching him to want. The sunglasses that Wesker wore in every documented appearance from the late 1990s onward were a small thing, a cosmetic detail, a practical consideration related to his changed eyes, but they were also the most persistent visible element of who he was across 11 years of documented activity after his resurrection. And there is something in them that stays with you if you think about it long enough. Eyes that had changed. Eyes that he kept hidden. A face that gave nothing away because the eyes, which people instinctively look to for the truth of a person, were covered by dark lenses that reflected the world back at you without giving anything of the interior in return. Albert Wesker, approximately 1960 to March 2009. Real name unknown. Parents unknown. Born into a project he did not choose. Died in a volcano trying to pull a helicopter down with him, because dying alone in the lava was the one outcome his personality could not accommodate. The horror in his story is not the bodies, it is the biography. A child taken and shaped and used, who took and shaped and used everyone he encountered afterward, because that was the only model of how people related to each other that he had been given. Spencer built a weapon and was killed by it. The weapon built its own weapons and was destroyed by them. The cycle produces nothing that survives except the knowledge, and the knowledge is still out there, and the next person who picks it up will tell themselves a story about why they are different from the ones who came before. They will probably also wear dark glasses, and they will probably also believe, with absolute conviction, that this time the transformation will produce something worthy of the cost. If you made it all the way here genuinely, thank you. These scripts take a significant amount of time and research to put together, and knowing that someone sat with it the whole way through means more than I can easily say. If you found this relaxing or interesting or both, hitting the like button takes about a second and helps this video reach other people who might want exactly this kind of content when they are trying to wind down. Drop a comment telling me what you think about Wesker's story. Is he a tragedy, a monster, or both? I would genuinely love to read what you think. And if there is a Resident Evil topic you want me to cover next, put it in the comments too. I read them. Every one of them. Rest well. Get comfortable, and we will see you in the next one. End of script expansion. Section 1 Additional content. The question of what Albert Wesker's real name might have been is one that the franchise has declined to answer across every game, every supplementary document, every interview with developers that has touched on the subject. This is not an oversight. The deliberate absence of his real name is itself a statement about what Project W actually did to its subjects. Spencer did not merely give them new names. He erased the old ones so completely that the erasure became permanent. The boy who existed before the agents came is inaccessible not just to us, but, by implication, to the man he became. There is no record to look back at. There is no origin story to recover. There is only the person that Spencer made, which is precisely how Spencer wanted it. Other children were taken alongside Albert. Project W was not a program built around a single subject. Spencer was working with statistical likelihood, understanding that not all of the children he selected would survive the eventual viral transformation, and that even among survivors, not all would develop the specific combination of qualities he needed. He needed multiple candidates. He needed the program to produce several viable subjects so that the inevitable failures along the way would not end the program entirely. How many Wesker children there were is not precisely documented in the main series games. What is established is that most of them died when the prototype virus was eventually administered, that only Albert and Alex Wesker survived the process, and that in Spencer's internal accounting, this represented a success rate he found acceptable. Alex Wesker's story runs parallel to Albert's in ways that illuminate what the program was designed to produce by showing the same origin, producing a different outcome. Alex did not receive the prototype virus in the same circumstances that Albert did. She had a degenerative disease that made the standard administration methodology impossible. Spencer, apparently, had designated her as a contingency plan of sorts, someone who would find an alternative route to the same destination in case Albert's path failed. She was extraordinary in her own right, perhaps even more intellectually gifted than Albert in certain analytical dimensions, and the path she pursued in Revelations 2 was horrifying, in ways that complemented rather than duplicated what Albert had done. Same origin, different instruments, different atrocities. What Spencer had actually succeeded in doing with Project W was creating a reliable method for producing people who were both genuinely exceptional and fundamentally unable to integrate into the normal social fabric of the world around them. The training had produced beings who understood power and hierarchy and the use of other people as instruments, but who had been carefully sealed off from the kinds of ordinary human connection that most people build their internal stability around. They were extraordinary, and they were alone in a very specific way. The kind of aloneness that cannot be remedied by placing someone in a room full of other people because the isolation is structural rather than circumstantial. This is, in retrospect, exactly what Spencer needed them to be. Connected people, people with genuine relationships and loyalties to other human beings, would have been difficult to deploy against their own species. The Wesker children's social isolation was not a side effect of the program. It was a design specification. Expansion. Section 3 Additional content. The 13 years Wesker spent in the Arklay laboratory between 1978 and 1991 were not a static period. They were marked by a progression of increasingly morally complex involvements that each left him slightly more removed from any framework that would have produced resistance to what came next. This is how complicity works in institutional context. You do not arrive at participating in atrocities by crossing one large, obvious line. You cross 100 small lines, each of which follows from the last with a logic that feels internally coherent, even as the external view of where you have arrived would produce horror in anyone looking from the outside. The early T-virus work was genuinely valuable in the abstract scientific sense. The research into viral mechanisms, the understanding of how different organisms could be combined at a genetic level, the mapping of how the immune system responds to different classes of infection, all of this had applications that went beyond what Umbrella was trying to do with it. Wesker knew this. He could see the theoretical applications clearly. He was smart enough to understand that the same research that was producing weapons could, under different institutional auspices, have been producing medicine. The mechanism did not care which direction it was pointed. But the subjects of that research were people. The bodies that the T-virus variants had been tested on since before Wesker arrived in the lab were people who had been brought in through methods that did not include their informed consent. The files documenting those tests were clinical because clinical language was how the institution processed what it was doing. Subject terminated following failed integration. Subject exhibited rejection response leading to organ failure. Subject demonstrated acceptable transformation parameters, but behavioral instability rendered it unsuitable for deployment. Clean language for things that were not clean at all. Wesker read those files. He contributed to them. He produced his own entries in the same clinical language because that was the institutional convention, and he had been shaped by institutional conventions since childhood. The language normalized what it described, and the normalization served the institution's function, which was to keep its researchers working on the research rather than having the kind of crisis of conscience that would have required someone to either leave or report what was happening. He also, over those 13 years, developed the specific relationship with the T-virus that would eventually become the conceptual foundation for everything he built after leaving Umbrella. He understood the virus not just mechanically, but almost aesthetically. He had preferences among its variants in the way a craftsperson has preferences among tools, not just for their utility, but for the specific qualities of how they worked. He found the cellular replacement mechanisms genuinely elegant. The way a sufficiently modified strain could maintain consciousness through a transformation that destroyed the original biological architecture was something he returned to in his thinking for years before he had a personal stake in what it meant. The Tyrant research, specifically, had produced in him a very particular kind of interest. Every Tyrant trial was a data point in the larger question of how much the human body could be transformed while still maintaining something recognizable as function. Most trials answered that question with failure, with subjects who did not survive the transformation, or who survived it in forms that were not functional in any useful sense. But occasionally, rarely, a trial produced something that survived and remained coherent. And those rare outcomes were the ones that Wesker studied with an attention that went beyond professional necessity. What he was looking at in those successful Tyrant trials was a version of the question he was eventually going to be asking about himself. Expansion. Section 6, Additional Content. The destruction of Raccoon City on October 1st, 1998, produced an outcome that Umbrella's enemies had been working toward for years without being able to achieve through conventional means. The company's liability in the disaster was documented. The lawsuits were filed within months. Congressional hearings began. International cooperation between the U.S. and Russia, both of whom had reasons to want Umbrella's assets accessible after the company's collapse, moved through diplomatic channels that ran parallel to the legal proceedings. Wesker watched all of this from a position of genuine satisfaction, not because he had caused Raccoon City exactly, though his fingerprints were on the context that had made the outbreak possible, but because the collapse of Umbrella meant the collapse of the institution that had created him and owned him and would eventually have disposed of him. There is a specific kind of pleasure that comes from watching a system that oppressed you implode under its own weight, even when you were yourself a contributing element to the weight that broke it. Wesker felt something in that register during the months of Umbrella's institutional death, though he would never have used a word like pleasure to describe anything he felt. He was simultaneously building. The collection of viral materials that had started with the ArcLay data was expanding. The rival organization was proving to be a useful institutional home because it provided resources without the kind of paternalistic surveillance that Umbrella had always maintained. He was valued for what he produced rather than monitored as a project that Spencer needed to keep control of. The distinction mattered enormously to someone who had spent 20 years inside the more suffocating version of the arrangement. The relationship between Wesker and Ada Wong during this period is worth dwelling on because it does not fit cleanly into the instrumental framework that characterized most of his professional relationships. Ada was working for the rival organization as an independent contractor in the same way that Wesker was, which meant their institutional relationship was collegial rather than hierarchical. She was also genuinely capable in ways that he found professionally interesting. She operated in conditions that would have killed most people, maintained cover identities under extreme pressure, and demonstrated judgment in the field that was consistently better than her operational briefings gave her credit for. He used her. She knew he used her. She used him in return when it suited her purposes. The arrangement between them had a kind of mutual transparency about its transactional nature that made it the most honest professional relationship in Wesker's documented history. Neither of them pretended there was warmth in what they were doing. Neither of them claimed a loyalty that they were not prepared to honor when tested. The relationship was what it was: two extraordinarily capable people using each other's capabilities toward occasionally aligned and occasionally divergent goals, and the occasions when their goals diverged, as in the Spain mission, were handled with the same cold professionalism as the occasions when they aligned. Expansion. Section 9. Additional content. The Kajuju operation had a texture to it that the earlier phases of Wesker's career had lacked. He had spent 11 years since the Spencer mansion operating in ways that kept him at a remove from direct confrontation. He had been the person behind the scenes, the figure in the shadows, the intelligence at the center of a web that other people moved through but without fully understanding. He had encountered Chris Redfield twice, at Rockford and at the Russian Umbrella facility, and both times had demonstrated the gap between them without fully engaging. There was always somewhere else to be, something else more pressing than the satisfaction of a personal confrontation. In Kajuju, he engaged. Not reluctantly, not strategically, but with the specific and somewhat alarming enthusiasm of someone who has been waiting for a situation where full deployment was justified. The Ouroboros plan was in its final stage. The constraints that had kept him operating in shadow no longer applied in the same way. He was, in some operational sense, at the end of the need for concealment, because what was coming after the deployment did not require him to maintain any existing cover. He could be what he was. This produced interactions with Chris and Sheva that had a different quality from any previous encounter in the franchise. He was explaining himself. Not justifying himself, because he did not recognize the framework in which justification would be required, but articulating the philosophy behind what he was doing, in terms that made clear he believed it was correct and wanted at least one person in the world to understand it correctly. The person he chose to explain himself to was Chris Redfield, which tells you something about what Wesker's relationship to Chris actually was, underneath all the years of attempted killing and institutional opposition. Chris was the closest thing to a genuine opponent that Wesker had encountered. Not in terms of capability, obviously, because the gap there was real and Wesker understood it, but in terms of what the opposition represented. Chris had been fighting Wesker's work since 1998. He had survived the mansion incident and built the BSAA and spent years pursuing exactly the thread that led to Kajuju. He had refused to stop in the specific way that Wesker respected, not because he agreed with it, but because the refusal to stop in the face of overwhelming opposing force was the only quality he considered worth recognizing in another person. Chris had it. He had always had it. The injected overdose of PG67-AW, or the missed injection, or whatever combination of disruption to the medication schedule had produced the metabolic instability that manifested in the volcanic confrontation, was in some sense the most human thing that happened to Wesker in his entire post-1998 existence. He was not destroyed by Chris Redfield's capability. He was destroyed by the failure of a biological system that required careful maintenance, which is the kind of failure that happens to people, to organic beings dependent on metabolic processes that have margins and limits and conditions under which they break down. He had spent 11 years performing invulnerability. He was ended by a dosing error. This is not diminishing. It is, in its own way, more true to the reality of what he was than the version of his end that would have involved him being simply outmatched in a straight confrontation. He was not outmatched. He was running a process that could not be maintained indefinitely without the careful external management that Excella had been providing, and Excella was dead, and the management had failed, and the process consumed him. Expansion. Section 10. Additional content. The legacy of Albert Wesker in the Resident Evil universe operates at multiple levels that are worth separating out carefully. At the most immediate level, the level of physical consequences, his legacy includes the Raccoon City disaster in its broadest scope. While he did not directly cause the outbreak, the T-virus research that he had spent 13 years advancing was the scientific foundation of the Arkley incident and of everything the virus did afterward. The BOWs that escaped the lab, the zombification of the Arkley population, the G-virus incident that destroyed Raccoon City, all of it was built on research that Wesker's time at the Arkley lab had advanced significantly. He was not the sole author, but he was a major contributor. The bioweapons market that he built and operated after leaving Umbrella seeded multiple subsequent crises. The T. Veronica virus he sold to Javier Hidalgo killed and transformed hundreds of people in South America. The Plagas samples from his Spain operation found their way into multiple subsequent bioterrorism events that the franchise documents in later installments. The Ouroboros plan, even in its failure, produced the viral research that Alex Wesker would later attempt to use toward her own ends in Revelations 2. The methodology he had developed, the approach to using the progenitor virus as a foundation for more stable transformative strains, was preserved in the research notes that survived the Kajuju operation and became part of the intelligence archive that subsequent antagonists in the series drew on. At the level of institutional impact, his legacy includes the BSAA itself, which was founded in part as a response to the bioterrorism that his operations and Umbrella's collapse had demonstrated was a genuine global threat. Chris Redfield's entire subsequent career was shaped by the pursuit of Wesker and the consequences of what Wesker had built. The international bioterrorism framework that the BSAA represents was made necessary in large part by the world that Wesker helped create. At the thematic level, which is where the franchise's deepest engagement with his story lives, his legacy is the question that his existence poses about the relationship between what a person was made to be and what they are responsible for. Spencer built the framework. Wesker made the choices within it. Both of these things are true simultaneously, and the franchise does not resolve the tension between them because the tension is the point. The horror of Wesker's story is not that a person became evil. It is that the conditions under which a person becomes capable of what Wesker became are not as rare or as exotic as we prefer to think they are. The prototype virus that killed and rebuilt him. The Ouroboros project that would have killed most of humanity. The people he used and discarded across 49 years of documented existence. These are the things he built. The laboratory he grew up in, and the childhood he never had, and the name he was never given. These are the things that were built around him. Where the line runs between these two categories of construction is the question that the sunglasses always manage to obscure, not just from the other characters in the story, but from Wesker himself. He was the most successful thing Spencer ever made. He was also the most complete demonstration of why the project was, from any perspective other than Spencer's, a catastrophe. The excellence it produced came at a cost that the people who paid it had never agreed to pay. The boy who became Albert Wesker. The thousands of test subjects who became T-virus data. The populations of Raccoon City and Kajuju and every other community that the ripple effects of the research touched. They paid for what Spencer wanted to build, and what Spencer wanted to build died in a volcano in 2009. But the knowledge did not. The knowledge never dies in these stories. It persists, changes hands, finds new architects with new justifications, and produces new disasters that the people who survived the previous one will spend the rest of their lives trying to prevent. This is the loop that the Resident Evil franchise has been tracing since 1998, and Wesker's story is the clearest single thread through that loop. He is where the progenitor virus research became a specific human tragedy rather than just a corporate crime. He is where the abstract ambition of Spencer's project became a physical force in the world. He is the center of the argument the franchise makes, quietly and persistently across more than 2 decades of games. That the horror is never the monsters. The horror is always the people who thought the monsters were worth making. Additional content ends here. Expansion. Section 4. The Art of the Double Life. Something that rarely gets examined carefully in discussions of Wesker's time inside STARS is how long that period actually was. He was not inserted into the unit as a rapid deployment for a specific operation. He was embedded there for years. He attended meetings and training sessions and interdepartmental briefings in the kind of administrative minutia that fills up the working lives of anyone in law enforcement or paramilitary service. He went to the events. He showed up. He was present in all of the ways that presence in an institutional context requires. This means that the people around him had years of consistent experience with him as their commanding officer. Barry Burton had a professional relationship with Captain Wesker that extended back long enough to produce the kind of practical familiarity that comes from working alongside someone through genuine emergencies. Jill Valentine had trained under him, had learned from him, had the kind of respect for his professional competence that develops between people in high-stakes fields when one of them demonstrably knows what they are doing. Chris Redfield had the specific, complicated relationship with authority that people who are simultaneously excellent at their work and slightly resistant to institutional hierarchy tend to develop with the person above them who manages to be both demanding and worth following. None of them suspected him. This is the remarkable thing in retrospect. Not that he was able to deceive them for a week or a month or across a single mission. That he was able to maintain the performance across years of proximity without any of them detecting the specific quality of wrongness that a person living a total lie tends to produce in their interactions. The sunglasses helped, obviously. The controlled expression helped. But the fundamental reason the performance held up was that Wesker was not performing something entirely external to who he was. He was a genuinely excellent commanding officer in the functional sense. He made good decisions, he trained people effectively, he assessed situations with real accuracy and communicated those assessments clearly. The professional qualities that made the STARS team trust him were real. They just coexisted with an entirely different set of intentions that they were not equipped to detect because his training had produced a compartmentalization so complete that the two versions of himself did not bleed into each other. The Barry Burton manipulation in particular is worth examining. Wesker had identified Barry as the team member most vulnerable to a specific kind of emotional leverage long before the night of July 24th. Barry had a family. He had a wife and daughters that he visibly prioritized in the way that certain people with strong familial attachment make that prioritization legible to anyone paying attention. He was the kind of person whose greatest strength, loyalty, and love was also his clearest operational vulnerability, because threatening what he most loved was the most reliable way to control his behavior in situations where physical control was not available or appropriate. Wesker used this with surgical precision during the mansion incident, giving Barry enough information to keep him confused and compliant, using the threat to his family to ensure that Barry would guide rather than protect the STARS members in ways that maximized their exposure to the BOWs. Barry's guilt about this lasted for years after the incident. He could not fully disentangle his own responsibility from the structural situation Wesker had put him in, which is another example of how Wesker's approach to human beings as instruments was not simply cruel but specifically engineered to produce maximum utility while distributing the cost of that utility onto the people being used. The rival company, the organization that eventually became HCF in documented references, had been cultivating Wesker for years before the mansion incident. The approach to defection was not a spontaneous decision made in the final months before the incident. It was a carefully managed transition that had been in process since at least the early 1990s, when the combination of Marcus's assassination, Birkin's G-virus approval, and Wesker's own growing clarity about what Spencer would eventually do with him had converged into a specific enough understanding of the future to justify beginning active preparations. The rival company's operatives had made contact through channels that left no institutional trace. The terms of the defection arrangement were specific. Wesker would deliver combat data from a live STARS engagement with Umbrella's bows. He would deliver biological samples from the Arclay lab. He would provide the intelligence value of the T-virus research he had spent 13 years accumulating. In return, he would receive operational resources, safe identities, laboratory access, and the institutional backing that an independent operator needed to continue working at the level of complexity and risk that his plans required. The prototype virus was not part of the original defection arrangement. That was something Wesker had negotiated separately, through Birkin, using the logic that a defector who died in the field was worth nothing to anyone. His employers had agreed that maintaining his biological function through the incident was a reasonable investment. Neither of them had fully predicted what the prototype would actually do when activated, because the transformation it produced went significantly beyond the theoretical parameters that Birkin had modeled for it. The models had predicted enhancement. What actually happened was something closer to replacement. But the replacement was so complete and so consistent with the prior identity that the distinction barely mattered in the practical terms of what Wesker became and what he could do with it. Expansion. Section 7. The Spider's Philosophy. The bioweapons market that Wesker operated within between 1998 and 2004 was not simply a commercial arrangement. It was a laboratory without walls, a way of studying the real-world deployment of viral agents across conditions that no institutional research program could ethically produce and no legitimate military test range could safely contain. Every sale he made, every viral sample he placed in the hands of someone who was going to use it in a context that generated casualties was, from his perspective, a field trial. An opportunity to observe how his products performed outside of the controlled conditions that laboratory testing inevitably represented. This is one of the dimensions of Wesker's psychology that makes him genuinely disturbing rather than simply dangerous. He was not selling bioweapons because he needed money, though the money was useful. He was selling them because the sales generated information. Every outbreak he enabled was a dataset. Every containment failure was a lesson in viral behavior under field conditions that no amount of theoretical modeling could replicate. He was conducting research at the expense of communities he had no personal relationship with and no particular feelings about, which was exactly what the Arkley lab had been doing for years before he arrived there, and exactly what his training had prepared him to do without producing the kind of internal resistance that would have required a different framework for thinking about other human beings than the one Spencer had given him. The Javier Hidalgo situation, specifically, produced data that Wesker found genuinely significant about the T. veronica virus's behavior in hosts who had not undergone the cryogenic stabilization period. The organ transplant method that Hidalgo had used to maintain Manuela's integration had produced a unique biological situation. A host who was partially integrated with T. veronica in a way that was neither the catastrophic failure that most non-cryo recipients experienced, nor the extraordinary success that Alexia's 17 years of careful integration had produced. Manuela was something between, and studying what that middle state looked like in behavioral and biological terms gave Wesker specific information about the virus's integration timeline that he would not have had from any other source. He was also, during this period, watching Leon Kennedy without making contact. Leon had become something interesting after Raccoon City. He had gone from a rookie cop dropped into an impossible situation to a genuinely capable government agent who had survived multiple engagements with viral events and had developed the specific kind of expertise that comes from repeatedly not dying in situations designed to kill you. He was not a factor in Wesker's plans in any direct sense, but he was a useful data point in the ongoing assessment of what human capability could achieve against the kind of biological opposition that Wesker's work produced. Leon was, in that specific sense, the control group, the unenhanced human being of exceptional capability, operating at the extreme end of what natural biology could produce, providing a baseline for comparison. The Ada Wong dynamic during this period also involved an element of genuine respect that Wesker found mildly uncomfortable to account for, within his usual framework for thinking about people. She was not simply a tool in the way that most of his human instruments were tools. She was capable enough that deploying her required genuine assessment of what she was likely to do, which was not the same as managing a subordinate's behavior. Her eventual deviation from his instructions in Spain was not a surprise to him in the sense of being unpredictable. It was a calculated choice he had assessed she might make, that he had attempted to prevent through the architecture of the mission, and that she had made anyway because her capabilities were sufficient to find the gap in his architecture that he had not been able to fully close. He added it to his model of her. He did not punish her for it in any direct sense, partly because the punitive relationship was not one they had, and partly because the information her deviation produced about the limits of his ability to predict and control her was itself useful. A person whose behavior you can perfectly predict is a lesser intelligence instrument than a person whose behavior you can mostly predict but who occasionally does something that updates your model. Ada Wong was the latter, and Wesker had enough intellectual honesty to recognize that this made her more valuable than a more compliant but less capable asset would have been. Expansion. Section 8. What Spencer actually told him. The conversation between Wesker and Spencer at the estate, documented partially through subsequent dialogue and narrative fragments, deserves more attention than it usually gets because it is the moment in Wesker's story where the architecture of everything Spencer had built is revealed from the inside. Spencer had spent years in hiding following Umbrella's collapse. He was old. He was physically deteriorating in ways that his wealth could slow but not stop. He was connected to medical equipment that kept his failing body functional past the point where it would otherwise have given out. He was also, apparently, still thinking. Still processing the project that had consumed his life. Still working through the implications of what he had done and whether it had achieved what he had intended. He had decided, apparently, that Wesker deserved to know the truth. Or more precisely, he had decided that telling Wesker the truth was the most interesting thing left available to him, and Spencer had always prioritized the interesting over the appropriate. The truth he told was this. Project W had been designed not to produce servants for Spencer's vision, but to produce an heir. Spencer had never intended to be the god of a new world himself. He had always known his body would fail before the project reached its conclusion. What he had been building, across decades of careful eugenics and viral research and ideological shaping, was the person who would complete what he had started. Not as Spencer's servant, as Spencer's successor, as the next stage of the project itself. In Spencer's telling, Albert Wesker was not a product of the project. He was its purpose. The virus, the training, the ideology, all of it had been aimed at producing exactly the kind of entity that Albert Wesker had become. Spencer had wanted to create something beyond himself, something that would take the vision he had been unable to complete in a single human lifetime and carry it forward. He had succeeded. The project had worked, and he wanted Wesker to understand that the ambition driving him, the desire to remake humanity, the belief in his own superiority, the God complex, all of it had been put there deliberately as the necessary psychological architecture for the kind of being who could actually accomplish what Spencer had in mind. Wesker killed him immediately after this revelation, which Spencer had apparently anticipated might happen. There are later fragments of dialogue suggesting that Spencer had deliberately leaked his location, knowing that Wesker might respond this way, that he had decided that dying at the hands of his most successful creation was the most appropriate ending available to him. A kind of apotheosis by proxy, the creator killed by the thing he created. There is an argument that Spencer found this romantic in the specific way that megalomaniacs find the logical conclusions of their own narratives romantic when those conclusions involve them at the center. What Wesker took from the conversation was something he later articulated to Chris in the context of what followed. The revelation that his ambitions had been installed, rather than arrived at independently, did not produce in him the crisis of identity that Spencer might have expected, or hoped for, or planned around. Instead, it produced a specific kind of clarification. The goal was still correct. The method was still sound. The fact that he had been pointed at that goal from childhood, rather than discovering it through his own reasoning, was irrelevant to its validity. If anything, it suggested that the goal was so foundational to the kind of being he represented that it had been identified and deliberately cultivated before he was old enough to choose it. The pre-chosen nature of his ambition was not evidence that it was wrong. It was evidence that it was inevitable. This is the most disturbing move in Wesker's entire documented philosophical development. He used the revelation that he had been manipulated as confirmation that the thing he had been manipulated toward was correct. Spencer had installed the God complex, and the God complex had survived the revelation of its installation. Not in spite of that revelation, but because of it. The very thoroughness of Spencer's project had made its product resistant to the information about how it had been produced. Final note: the ongoing conversation. Resident Evil is at its most interesting when it refuses to be just about the monsters. It is most interesting when it is about the systems that create monsters, the people who believe their intentions justify their methods, the institutions that outlast the individuals who built them, and the knowledge that persists past every attempt to contain or destroy it. Albert Wesker is the franchise's clearest single articulation of all of these themes. He was a system that produced a monster, while also being a monster who produced systems. He was the victim of a project and the architect of a catastrophe. He was a boy without a name who became a man who wanted to give the world a new name through the most violent means available to him. He was, in the end, exactly what Spencer had built him to be, which is precisely why Spencer's death at his hands was the only real ending that story could have had. The volcanoes and the rocket launchers and the lava and the helicopters are the spectacle. The boy taken from his parents in the early 1960s is the substance. The franchise has always known this, even when it was doing its best to not quite say it out loud. And somewhere in the franchise's ongoing present, with games and stories still being developed and released, the questions that Wesker embodied are still being asked. About what we build when we build institutions. About who pays for what those institutions produce. About the children who get handed frameworks they did not ask for and do not know how to refuse. These questions do not have clean answers. That is why they keep being asked. And that is why, more than 25 years after a man in dark glasses betrayed his team in a burning mansion in the Arkley Mountains, the story of Albert Wesker still has things to say that are worth listening to. Rest well.